Welcome to the SAFeTy Chronicles, exploring how to keep people and pets safe from the cycle of interpersonal violence. I am your host, Allie Phillips, founder and CEO of Sheltering Animals and Families Together, the SAFeTy Program, a nonprofit organization working with domestic violence shelters to eliminate the pet housing barrier to safety. As the founder, I have led the global movement in helping domestic violence shelters create on-site pet housing while elevating the criminal justice response to how animal abuse links to crimes against people. I am a former prosecuting attorney, internationally recognized legal expert, and public speaker, award-winning author, and advocate for protecting vulnerable victims. In this podcast, we will explore how and why animals are harmed in the cycle of family violence and the human-animal bond that keeps victims in harm's way with their pets. Guest speakers and I will share strategies for shelters and professionals working to safeguard survivors, why pet-inclusive sheltering is life-saving, and safety tips for those who need help. None of the content will be graphic. If you are in harm's way, please contact your nearest domestic violence shelter or call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. Let's get started. Welcome back to another episode of the SAFeTy Chronicles. So, first of all, do you like my cat unicorn here? I tell you, this just brings me so much joy having this cat unicorn on my office wall. I just love it. I hope you do too. So anyway, today I want to talk about the concept and some of the research that explains why a domestic violence survivor would stay in an abusive situation because of their pet. Okay, so this is a big topic, but I'm going to keep it really short and I'm going to summarize it as succinctly as I can, which for an attorney, it's really hard to be succinct most days. So the research involving the link between animal abuse and domestic violence literally goes back to the early 1980s. So there is such a growing body of research. I don't think we can say that there is no such link, all right? So some days it's hard to keep up with the research. And that's a good thing because we need this research because it helps drive legislation and policies. And when you ask anyone who loves a companion animal what they would do if they were in an abusive situation or were forced to evacuate their home, like in a natural or man-made disaster, this is what I always hear. I will never leave my pet behind. I will never leave my pet behind. I get it. I have 3 cats. I will never leave them behind. So when there is a threat, the human-animal bond and the desire to protect our pets instinctively kicks in. And I'll tell you, this was really driven home to me in, when was it? 2005 is when Hurricane Katrina hit the Gulf Coast, and people stayed behind to protect their pets, knowing they were in the path of danger and could lose their life. Isn't that exactly what domestic violence is? Staying in a situation of danger to protect your pets, knowing you could lose your life. It's the same dynamic. So we see it play out in natural and man-made disasters. And so I want to summarize some of the research so that you can understand why pet-inclusive domestic violence shelters are needed and why someone might remain in an abusive environment or a dangerous situation if they are not allowed to leave with their pet. And also I want to talk about how pets can actually save the lives of people who are in dangerous situations. So as far back as 1983, we have known that there is a high degree of correlation between animal abuse and child abuse, creating a significant predictor of that child becoming violent. There is also a high degree of correlation between animal abuse and domestic violence. As high as 89% of domestic violence incidents where there is an animal in the home also includes the co-occurring violence against animals. And it happens in the power and control cycle of abusers, and is sometimes motivated by jealousy regarding this human-animal bond. So, from study to study, the numbers change. They can be higher, they can be lower, but I find that the percentages of animals connected to child abuse and domestic violence is increasing with each study, because the number of pets in homes is increasing. The percentages are increasing. The number of animals per home are increasing. And so we now know that up to 88% of domestic violence victims will delay leaving an abusive home or will remain in an abusive home in order to care for their pets. And this includes farm animals. This includes horses and sheep and cows and pot-bellied pigs and every animal that we give our heart to. Now, for some victims who cope with the abuse, their pets keep them going. Their pets provide support, and their pets even support them in not taking their own life. So, this is kind of the sobering part of the work that I do, because there are studies that have told us that up to 80% of women who attempt suicide indicate that an abusive relationship was a factor in their decision to take their own lives. That is a sobering number. Pets give us a reason to live. And in domestic violence situations, that is so very true. The social and the the social and the emotional support of a pet is so often misunderstood until that relationship ends with the death of a pet. And that's when people realize sometimes how strong that connection was to the pet. And so domestic violence victims are often experiencing the death of pets at higher rates than those who are not in abusive situations. And so it can actually strengthen the bond with the pets that are still remaining in the home. So just this year in 2003, a study was published by a lady that I know who is phenomenal at researching this particular topic. She's a professor at University of Ontario. Her name is Amy Fitzgerald. And in her latest study, she interviewed 26 women, 3 of whom were still with the abusive partner. And her study confirms what many of us already know. And this is what the study told us: that pets are family members. And victims of domestic violence would talk to their pet about things that they could not confide in the abuser. One of the women in the study said, "It's like my pet knows what I'm thinking." The second thing she found was that pets were a factor in whether a domestic violence victim could leave the abusive situation. Here's a quote from her study. "Lindsay refused to go to a battered woman's shelter after an abusive incident because the police advised her that she could not take the dog along. She also reported that she stayed with her partner for nearly 2.5 years because he threatened to take the dog if they split up." Pets are a factor in whether survivors stay or leave. The third factor in her study was that pets made the abuse tolerable. In the study, a woman named Evelyn said her pet rat kept her going, made the abuse tolerable until it was safe to leave. The fourth thing that Professor Fitzgerald found were that pets were physical protectors and took on the abuse, both physical and emotional, to save their human owners. So the abuse between the people and the pets were similar, which created more empathy by the person toward the pet because they were literally having a shared experience. The fifth aspect were that pets provided social and emotional support the abuser could or would not offer. Pets were the only thing that these survivors had. Pets came to their aid when they needed it. The sixth thing were that these domestic violence victims and survivors will have pets in order to fill a void left by the abuser, fill an emotional void, a void of love that the abuser could not or would not give to the victim. And that's what the pets did. The seventh aspect were that having a pet helped survivors understand that they needed to get to a safe place with their pet, that they all needed to be saved. And then the last aspect was that pets kept survivors alive. One survivor in the study said, and I'm going to quote, "My animals kept me grounded. They were part of my lifeline to stay alive. If I wouldn't have had them, I would have been dead." So I often hear from people who are not in abusive situations who question, why do they stay in an abusive situation? Why don't they just leave? It's because domestic violence is a complex situation with a lot of dynamics. And the comfort and security of a pet can make it even more complex because the domestic violence victim is not just thinking about him or herself. They are thinking about their children if they have children and their pets if they have pets. It becomes more complex. And so I hope some of this research that I just summarized helps to shed some light on the dynamics and explain even more why pet inclusive shelters are needed. Because not only does it get the entire family to safety, it also saves the lives of human and animals. So my question is, do you have a SAFeTy shelter in your community? You may have one in your state, but many domestic violence survivors do not have the funds or the transportation to travel. So do you have one in your community? If you don't, potentially 70% of your community is delaying leaving an abusive situation or remaining in an abusive situation. And that creates unsafe communities. So I'm going to put a link in the comments below. If you would share it with your local domestic violence shelter and ask them to request the SAFeTy Startup Manual. It is a manual that they can read that will help them understand the steps to take to become a pet inclusive shelter. And that is how you can help your community. All right, thanks for tuning in. If you are in harm's way and need help, visit the Pet Inclusive Shelter listing at safetyprogram.org. Call your nearest domestic violence shelter, or call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 800-799-7233. Want to support our efforts and help us keep the SAFeTy Startup Manual free for domestic violence shelters? Consider donating at safetyprogram.org/donate. Your donation saves lives.